Excuse me. Good morning, everybody. My name is Liz Eberline. I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum in Washington, D.C. And we are a museum without walls. So we do a lot of our programming digitally. So we do a lot of our programs this way. So thank you all very much for participating from your homes. I have asked you all to, also my cat may kind of jump into the frame. So his name is Satchmo, if he does. So if you guys would keep your cameras off during the duration, I have also muted you all. There will be a point at the end of the presentation where you will be able to ask questions, and I'll ask you to use the chat function to ask the questions, and those questions are coming directly to me. Nobody else is going to see them, so when you ask a question, it's private. So I'm going to admit it looks like I've got one more person who's looking to get into the room, and I'm going to go ahead and begin. So this program is called Taking a Stand. This is the second part of a two-part program. This particular program begins in about the 1870s. So some of you did part one on Monday, so you have kind of this lead up to today. For those of you that did not participate in part one, a quick recap of kind of where we're starting, where we left off and where we're starting today. Our suffrage part one program concluded with the split of the American Equal Rights Association into two parts. And that split was between the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, as I go through here today, it might be a little difficult to kind of keep up with all of these different terms. A lot of these names for these organizations are the same. So again, if you have a question, if you need some clarification, just write your question down and I'll be happy to answer those questions at the end of the program. But the American Equal Rights Association split into two parts. The first part was the National Women's Suffrage Association. The second part was the American Women's Suffrage Association. We also kind of ended with the passage of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, and the American Women's Suffrage Association supported the 15th Amendment. Today's program, Suffrage Part 2, will pick up shortly after this happens and will cover the time between about 1870 up to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So one of the things that the suffrage supporters were trying to do, the American Women's Suffrage Association was looking to pass suffrage on a state level. They were not looking to pass a federal amendment. So they were doing a state-by-state strategy to pass suffrage. They thought that this was going to be a more successful strategy than the National Women Suffrage Association strategy of passing an amendment to the Constitution. So they thought that getting states to pass their suffrage laws, as opposed to getting Congress to pass a federal amendment, was going to be a little bit more successful in the fight for suffrage. And at first, the campaign for laws to change on a state-by-state basis seems really promising. And you see right here this photo that I'm sharing to your screen. This is a map, and it shows you which states passed suffrage laws and what year they passed those suffrage laws. So you can see on the left-hand side of this map, it says suffrage granted 1869 Wyoming. Now, in 1869, when Wyoming passes a suffrage law, Wyoming is not yet a state. It is still a territory. However, when Wyoming becomes a state in 1890, Wyoming continues to allow women to vote. The earliest suffrage victories, as you can see on this map, the earliest suffrage victories state by state were in the West. So they were not happening really on the East Coast. They were specifically happening in the West and also the Midwest. And there's kind of this reason. So, you know, it kind of begs the question, why? Why was it more conducive? Why was the West more conducive to passing state suffrage laws? And a lot of this has to do with population disparity. So a lot of the population of the United States at this time was living on the East Coast. But at this time, people were starting to move out West. They were looking for more land, they were looking for more opportunity. So more people are starting to move out to the West, but there's still not as many people living in the West as the East. And this is kind of creating a few different things. It's leading to less distinct gender roles. So for instance, when I say a gender role, I am talking about men at the time were providers for their family. So they were out, they were making the money, they were providing for their family. Women were more on the domestic sphere. So they were staying at home, they were cooking, cleaning, taking care of their children. And those are very distinct gender roles. But with this kind of moving out West, there's a little bit of blurring of the lines of these gender roles. And I'm going to show you an example, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but this is a good example of what I'm talking about. So Jeannette Rankin, this is a photo of Jeannette Rankin. She is the first woman to hold federal office in the United States when she was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Montana in 1916. She was also reelected in 1940 to the U.S. House of Representatives. And she remains the only woman elected to Congress by the state of Montana. And I'm showing this to you as an example because running for federal office, becoming this involved in politics, this was not what was generally considered to be the gender role for a woman. So when I talk about blurring the gender lines, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Also in the West, because a lot of these people were moving out West, what is happening is a lot of men are moving out West for these opportunities, and also married men, so single men and married men. So there are a lot of single men out there, and by being more progressive in granting women the vote in these states are becoming more friendly to women, and it's making it more attractive to get these women to move out to these Western states. And it's also very important to note here that when I'm talking about suffrage being passed in these states, I'm not talking about being able to vote for a presidential election or being able to vote for congressmen or senators. I'm talking about these women are able to vote more on the local level. They're allowed to vote for things like school boards or things that would really affect them as a woman at home. But again, they are not allowed to vote for the president of the United States or these types of things. So there's a difference between state suffrage and a federal amendment. The rise of the Populist Party, which is a national political party that supported women's rights, is also helping to increase local support for women's rights in these states. So not only are women moving out to the West, and they're starting to be a little bit more supportive in their fight for women's rights. So it seems to be just a little bit more friendly for women to kind of move out West. There is also this resistance to women's suffrage. So this is not something that people found to be a very popular idea. It wasn't, at this time especially, it wasn't very supported. And as women's suffrage advocates kind of attempt to stretch the meaning of a woman's role to kind of incorporate the public act of voting into their specific role as citizens, there's this opposition, this indifference to women's suffrage, and it's depicted in kind of these ways. So these are postcards here that you see in front of you. These are just two examples. There are many examples, but these are just two examples. So one way that anti-suffrage supporters, so people who are not in support of women having the right to vote, they depict, so this is kind of like propaganda. So they're depicting the effect of what women being able to vote, what that effect would have on the men at home. So many of these anti-suffrage postcards for the time are depicting men performing what were then considered to be women's roles in the house, like cooking, cleaning, caring for their children. And they're showing these men doing this while their wives are out stumping for the vote and leading rallies and all of that stuff. Others are depicting, I did not show these ones, but other postcards depict suffragists as domineering, abusive, and physically ugly women who couldn't get a husband any other way than by trying to overthrow society. So these were really not very friendly to women. And as you can see here, these images show, you know, a man at home taking care of the child. He's doing the laundry. And in the other photo, the one on the left, the man is holding his two children who are crying. He's in a robe, so you imagine that he's trying to put the children to bed. And then you see off in the corner, you see a woman standing in front of a crowd. So this is really what they're depicting is, if you allow women to vote, it's going to kind of flip the gender roles in not ways that people were very excited about. And these cartoons are showing the worry that allowing women to become politically active and politically involved and to be allowed to vote, they're thinking that that this is going to flip the gender roles and emasculate men. So it's going to make men less manly. So again, the role of the man is to provide for the family, but by staying at home and having to take care of the children, it's going to make them less of a man. But it's also, on the other side of that, it's depicting women as more masculine. So they are not staying at home and doing what women are generally accepted to do at this time. They're not staying at home with the children. They're out, they're doing what a man would normally do. And the anti-suffrage advocates are arguing that because women take care of the home and children, they didn't have time to vote or stay updated on politics. And some people are arguing that women lack the expertise and the mental capacity to offer useful opinion about political issues. So they're really saying that women aren't smart enough to really fully understand all of the political issues that are happening, like men are able to understand. And it's very important to understand that those who are opposed to suffrage and the suffrage movement were not just men. Women are also opposing suffrage. And some of these women are against suffrage because voters have to serve on juries. If you register to vote, you then have to, if your name is polled, you then have to serve on a jury. And people believe that women shouldn't be subjected to the details of violence. So if you serve on a jury for a very violent offense, they think that women should not be subjected to that. Many people thought that suffragists were anti-female, anti-family, anti-American, and they think that political responsibilities would overburden already busy women. So if they are out stumping for political change, looking to get the right to vote, they'd still have to come home and cook, clean, and take care of the children, and that was just too much for a woman to take on. And as you can see here, this photograph here shows an anti-suffrage headquarters. So, you know, again, it's showing men here standing in front of this, but it's not just men who are opposing suffrage. Between 1896 and 1910, the suffrage movement kind of stagnates. It kind of comes to a little bit of a halt. And I'm going to go back to this map here. The National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, remember, they split off. It was originally the American Equal Rights Association, and then it split off into the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. But then it comes back together in 1890. They come back together and they form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The National American Women's Suffrage Association is focused at this point completely on suffrage. They are focused completely on gaining the right to vote. Previously, they were also interested in abolition and other areas. But now, when this National American Women's Suffrage Association comes back together and that forms, their entire focus is just on gaining the right to vote. But the early efforts to gain support for this movement fails, and it fails for a few different reasons. One of the reasons is that the strategy that the National American Women's Suffrage Association is employing in the southern states is completely alienating African American women in their attempts to build support. So white suffragists and their organizations are ignoring the challenges that African American women face. They're choosing not to integrate issues of race into their campaigns. Frederick Douglass, who was an active supporter for women's rights, who had spoken at every women's rights convention since the first one in 1848, is actually asked not to attend a women's rights convention in Atlanta in 1895. And he's asked not to attend by Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells believed that, again, they're in the South, so she believes that Black attendees of this convention held in Atlanta would be discriminated against, and she didn't want Frederick Douglass to feel humiliated or to keep anything from bringing Southern white women into the association. So their focus really is Southern white women. So they are really kind of alienating the African American population that would be in support of suffrage and women's rights. Another reason that it kind of fails is the death of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are really kind of two of the women that carried the suffrage movement on their back. Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies in 1902. Susan B. Anthony dies in 1906. And again, these were the leaders of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. They carried this movement on their back. And their death really sparks the question of who's going to carry the torch. And there's this uncertainty of who's going to take on a leadership role, how the organization was going to move forward. And the third, which leads us into the third reason. And the third reason is, after Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton die, Carrie Chapman Catt becomes the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and she very quickly alienates the working class and minority women because she is specifically targeting wealthy white women in society for their support. So she is not including women who are immigrants, who are minorities, and she's not including those working women. So at the time, we're in the midst of this kind of industrial revolution. And she's not including these working women. And that, again, really kind of stagnates the cause. Another reason is that because these African-American women are not being supported within this movement, they form their own movement. So again, they're not being included in the National American Woman Suffrage Association. So they come up with their own organization. And in 1896, Black reformers create their own association, which is the National Association of Colored Women. And there's no cohesion or unity between the National Association of Colored Women and the National American Woman Suffrage Association. They're fighting for the same thing, but they're fighting for it in different ways. And they have kind of different messages, and they're not communicating with each other. So this is also causing kind of this stagnation. The National American Woman Suffrage Association holds conventions that exclude Black women, and Black women are forced to march separately from their white counterpoints in suffrage parades. So again, there's no cohesion, no full messaging. So they're really kind of leaving out this huge chunk of people that could help with the support. Another reason, and the reason I came back to this map, is because there's a failure in state suffrage campaigns. Between about 1896 and 1910, there are 6 state campaigns for state suffrage that are waged. No states pass suffrage laws after Utah passes in 1896 until Washington State in 1910 and California in 1911. So there's about 14 years where there is not a single state that passes a suffrage law. And this really, again, kind of holds this movement back. However, in 1910 and 1911, when Washington and California passed the state suffrage, this kind of sparks new momentum into the movement. It's also the dawn of the progressive movement, which sparks a resurgence in popularity for the suffrage movement. And this is characterized by an increased concern for child labor laws, food and drug regulation, political corruption, and workers' welfare. So these issues are kind of naturally seen as being very suited to women and their ideas. And the National American Woman Suffrage Association originally was just fighting for suffrage. They weren't looking at other issues. but they start to kind of get involved, and they kind of start embracing these movements. And this helps tie suffrage to the labor movement. And it's starting to bring more working class women into the suffrage fold. So initially, when the National American Women's Suffrage Association is formed, they're not looking to include working class women. They're not looking to include minorities. But as the years kind of spin on into the 1900s, once the labor movement really gets going, then the National American Women's Suffrage Association embraces this, and they start to bring the working class women and more people into the fold. And that really helps to kind of get this movement rolling again. And Alice Paul. So Alice Paul is an activist. She's studying social work at the University of Birmingham in England. She joins the British suffrage movement, and she returns to the United States from England in 1912. And she's bringing with her, when she comes back to the United States, she's bringing with her new ideas and energy. So she, again, is kind of sparking more change and more momentum in the suffrage movement. And she's bringing these new ideas. She is, again, she was in England, and she is seeing the effects of the British suffrage movement. There is a difference between the American suffrage movement and the British suffrage movement. And it's really important to understand the difference, because the suffrage movement in England is more radical. And it's focused more on things that would get them noticed, and it would raise awareness for their cause. So they're looking for things that would get them written up in newspapers, or things like that. So they're looking for attention. That's really what they're looking to do. And Alice Paul, she's seeing this. She's in Britain, and she's seeing this, and she comes back to the United States in 1912. And she thinks that the National American Women's Suffrage Association needs to abandon their previous strategy of working to pass suffrage laws state by state. And there's no, the National American Women's Suffrage Association doesn't agree with that. And so Alice Paul breaks with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she founds the National Women's Party. And the National Women's Party, again, led by Alice Paul, is using bold, often radical tactics in order to try and force President Wilson to support suffrage. And one of the ways that they do this is by having a suffrage parade. In 1913, again, Alice Paul, having been involved with the British suffrage movement, understands the power of attracting the press. She decides that they're going to have this suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. So in March of 1913, March 3rd of 1913, there's this suffrage parade. And it's really kind of a brilliant move by Alice Paul, because they are holding this suffrage parade the day before Woodrow Wilson is to be inaugurated as President of the United States. So actually, there's a story where Woodrow Wilson shows up to Washington, D.C. at Union Station and on March 3rd, the day before his inauguration, and he sees this huge crowd. And he thinks that this crowd is there for him, but they're there for this suffrage parade. So Alice Paul is really understanding the power of media, the power of photographs to advance their cause. And she's really stealing this thunder from Woodrow Wilson, because, again, his inauguration is the next day. And the headlines and all of the photographs in this newspaper is not about the inauguration. It's about this suffrage parade. So again, the parade was held on March 3rd, 1913. It begins at the U.S. Capitol. It ends at the Treasury Building. There are approximately 8,000 suffragists who march on Washington. It's the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and the parade is led by a woman named Inez Milholland. And this woman right here, this is Inez Milholland. And Inez Milholland is a human rights lawyer. She's pictured here riding a white horse. She's draped in white clothing. She kind of looks like Joan of Arc. So she has this very kind of pure look to her. And this photograph is really kind of the dominant photograph from the parade. And this is another parade too. So you see the U.S. Capitol in the background. They're marching. These women are wearing white. That has kind of become the color of suffrage. And women who march, it's really important to understand that they were not, this crowd that is there for this parade is not all supportive of what they're trying to do. And the women that marched, they were spit on, they had lit cigars thrown at them, they were verbally abused, and they were harassed. In fact, they were harassed so much that there's a congressional investigation that's ordered to see if a lack of police response was intentional. So there's this congressional investigation that's launched to see if the police intentionally did not intervene when the women were being harassed. And you can see here, this is a photograph of the crowd that attended the suffrage parade. And you can see in here, the majority of those pictured are men. There are a good number of women in the photograph as well, but you can see how many people are attending this parade. And again, not all of these people are supporting what these women were doing. So you can just imagine what the women felt as they were moving through. And here's a different photograph. Again, you can see just the number of people. But the parade accomplishes what Alice Paul sets out to do, and that's to dominate the headlines in the newspapers to the point that it overshadows the inauguration. So in this way, she considers this to be a big win. Another way she kind of captures headlines is by picketing. So following the 1913 parade, so this is several years later, Alice Paul and her National Woman's Party, again, they make headlines after picketing the White House for a political cause. 1917, the United States has just gotten involved in World War I. And these women are standing outside the White House to picket because what they're saying is that the United States is involved in World War I. We have soldiers who are fighting over in Europe, who are fighting for democracy and who are fighting for freedom. But here in the United States, we are still being denied our rights. So what they're saying is that President Wilson is a little bit of a hypocrite. So what he's doing by sending his soldiers over and fighting for democracy and freedom, he's not doing that same thing in the United States. And here's another photograph here too. So these women who picket, you see they're standing on the sidewalk. And these women are actually arrested, and they are arrested for obstructing traffic. So again, they're standing on the sidewalk, they're not driving, they're not getting in anybody's way, but they are picketing outside the White House, and so they're arrested for obstructing traffic. And they're imprisoned in a place called the Occoquan Workhouse, OCCOQUAN, Occoquan Workhouse. And the Occoquan Workhouse is here in Northern Virginia. It still exists today. And these women are treated horribly. They are arrested, they are brought to the Occoquan Workhouse, so they're arrested in Washington, D.C., they're brought to Northern Virginia. So these women, they are not treated well. They're kind of being physically abused by the prison guards. And these women go on a hunger strike. And they're being force fed. So the guards are force feeding them food and water to the point where the women are getting sick. And it becomes this human rights issue. And lawyers get involved. And one of the things that they say is that because they were arrested in Washington, D.C., they should not have been imprisoned in Virginia, and they are eventually, a judge agrees, and they are eventually let go. They're not in prison for too long, but it's long enough for a lot of these women to kind of continue to suffer for the rest of their lives, really, because of what they have experienced in the Occoquan Workhouse. But again, they're dominating the headlines. They're getting their point across with the photographs and all of that. And this is a very big difference between what they are doing and what the National American Women's Suffrage Association is doing. Carrie Chapman Catt, who had briefly left her position as the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, returns as president of NAWSA in 1915. And instead of doing what Alice Paul is doing, in trying to dominate headlines, she's trying to be a little bit more diplomatic about things. And she's trying to convince Woodrow Wilson to support a federal amendment for women's suffrage. And at the time, Woodrow Wilson is not a supporter of suffrage, passing a federal amendment. It's not until 1918 that Woodrow Wilson begins to support a federal amendment for suffrage. And a lot of that has to do with World War I, because all of these men are fighting over in Europe, and a lot of what they would typically be doing in factories or on the home front, all of that, they can't do that. So women are stepping in, and they're pulling a lot of the weight. And Woodrow Wilson really recognizes that the country is continuing to function because of these women. And so he begins to start supporting a federal amendment. There's a little bit of a debate amongst historians. I don't know that there's really one right answer or anything that anybody has found, but there's a little bit of a debate over whether it was Alice Paul and her tactics of dominating headlines, or if it was Carrie Chapman Catt and her organization and kind of being a little bit more diplomatic, that really kind of drew, that was really more influential in the suffrage movement, but they did have very different ideas about how they were going to go about doing this. However, again, so 1918, President Wilson starts supporting a federal amendment, and the 19th Amendment, which prohibits states and federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex, is finally approved. So Woodrow Wilson begins to support this federal amendment, and in 1919, Congress approves a federal amendment to the Constitution, allowing suffrage, allowing women the right to vote. Now, what happens here is in June of 1919, Congress passes this. They're saying, yes, we want to do this. But what has to happen after that is they have to get, in order for this amendment to be ratified, they have to get 36 states to agree to the amendment in order to become law. And there's a deadline. So this Congress passes in June of 1919. They have to get 36 states to ratify this amendment by November of 1920. So in a little less than a year and a half, they have to get 36 states to agree to ratify this amendment. And the reason the deadline is November of 1920 is because of election. And there was going to be a presidential election. Members of Congress were going to be up for re-election. So they're up against this November deadline. By the summer of 1920, 35 of the 36 states that are needed do pass suffrage. However, there are, between that 35th state passing and the deadline, there are no further legislative sessions that are scheduled between the summer of 1920 and the election in November. And so the women, these women feel like this is just going to die. They're not going to get this ratified. However, Woodrow Wilson steps in, and he pressures the governor of Tennessee, who's very reluctant, into calling a session to vote on this particular issue. And what happens is you have this huge influx of suffragists and anti-suffragists who descend on Nashville and Tennessee in the summer of 1920. Anti-suffragists are arguing that women's suffrage is an extension of the 15th Amendment, and it would be an attack on states' rights to pass the 19th Amendment. The 15th Amendment in Southern states is not popular. It's resented that this amendment passes, and so there's really kind of this bad feeling with the Southern states in all of this. So that's what the anti-suffragists are arguing. Suffragists are obviously saying, yes, we need to support this. So on August 18th, 1920, the outcome of the vote is not guaranteed. They don't know one way or the other how this is going to go. And it comes down to one vote. So we need one more state to pass this in order for the amendment to be ratified. And there's one vote that stands between the ratification of this amendment and not passing the amendment. And it comes down to this gentleman. His name is Harry Byrne. He is 24 years old, and he is the deciding vote. He is the one that, no matter which way he votes, that is going to be how this ends. And his mother, her name is Feb King Ensminger Byrne. She sent him this letter, and she's urging him to vote in favor of suffrage. And he does. In fact, when he casts his vote, when he says, yay, yes, I want to vote in favor of suffrage, there's kind of this silence in the room because people don't quite understand what it is that he's just said. They haven't processed the fact that he has voted in favor. But he does. And so Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And the next day, there's such backlash against Harry Byrne that the next day, he defends his last-minute reversal in a speech to the assembly, and he says, for the very first time, he publicly states his personal support of universal suffrage, and he says that he believes that he had a moral and legal right to ratify this amendment. But he's also saying he's making no secret of the fact that his mother did influence him. So he believes on a moral and legal level, suffrage should pass. But he's also saying that his mother, the letter that his mother sent, and his mother in general has this influence over him. And he's saying that, you know, a mother's advice is always safest for her boy to follow. And he says, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification, and so I voted for ratification. And therefore, the 19th Amendment was officially ratified and added to the U.S. Constitution on August 26, 1920. So we have had, on August of this year, August of 2020, it will have been 100 years since women have had the universal suffrage, have been allowed to vote. It's a very big year for us. Obviously, 100 years seems like a long time, but you know, suffrage, having this right to vote, is a very important part of being a citizen. And it took a long time to get there, but these women who fought for a very long time did persevere, and that's, you know, kind of where our story ends today, is with the passage, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to open this up for questions. And you can use the chat function to send me a message. I'm sorry if you sent me a message while I was talking, I didn't receive it. But again, I am recording this, so we'll be able to send this to anybody that was not able to attend. But if you have a question as I was talking, if you want to send it to me, again, you're sending this question directly to me. Nobody else is going to see it. I'll repeat the question so that everybody knows the question that I'm answering. So if you'd like to take a few minutes to ask your questions. It is very sad that Lucy Burns was in prison, but again, it wasn't just her. It was all of those women who were picketing outside the White House. They were arrested, and sent to prison. So it was very sad for all of those women who were sent to prison. Did anyone die at the parade? Not to my knowledge. It didn't get physical it didn't get physical to that extent. So not to my knowledge, I don't believe anybody died at the parade. Did the Women's Party include women of color? If you remember from what I was talking about kind of in the middle of the presentation, when the National American Women's Suffrage Association, at the end of the 1800s, when they combined with those two other organizations and became the National American Women's Suffrage Association, women of color were not included in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And that is why African American women formed their own organization. As time kind of went on, they were included to some extent, but they were, if you look at these pictures of, and I'll go back, of the suffrage parade, a lot of these pictures, when you look at the marchers of the suffrage parade, these women, these are white women. So African American women were allowed to march at this parade, but they had to march separately from white women. So there is this segregation. So they were they were included, but they were not included at the same time. Simon is asking, how was President Wilson viewed by women suffragists? It depends, because President Wilson did not support a federal amendment to the Constitution supporting women's suffrage. So I think it was really frustrating for some of these women because, again, and I'll show you again, when they're picketing, they're standing outside the White House for a reason. They're picketing because they are thinking that Woodrow Wilson is what he's doing in sending soldiers to fight for freedom and democracy across in Europe. He's not providing that same freedom and democracy to his own citizens. So at the time, there is this kind of frustration between women's suffrage advocates and President Wilson because he's not supporting suffrage. And again, that changes in 1918. He does eventually begin to support women's suffrage, and he is the one who said that Tennessee needed to open up so that they could vote, so that 36 states could ratify. So I think there's some people, it depends on what time you're talking about. There is this frustration before he supports, and then he does eventually begin to support. So I don't think it was, you know, always a warm relationship, but eventually he does support the movement. Aaliyah is asking, did any men try to help women get their rights? Yeah, there were male supporters of women's suffrage. Frederick Douglass, I mentioned him. He was a supporter of women's rights. He spoke at women's rights conventions. There are some men who do support universal suffrage, but then again, there are many men who don't. So yes, there are some men who are supporting this, who are part of this movement, but there are many, many, many men who are not. Zoe is asking about the about the parade. She's asking about the investigation that Congress launched about police not interacting or getting involved with the harassment. She's asking, how do you think that will turn out? Who do you think will win? So there is a congressional investigation that was launched. I mean, it really didn't amount to a whole lot. I mean, these police were not intervening, and I believe that they were not intervening because they didn't support what these women were trying to do, but there wasn't really an outcome there. Caden is asking me, what flag, are you talking about this photo here, Caden? This flag right here, this is the suffrage flag. And you can't really see it because it's a black and white photo, but the colors of suffrage are purple, white, and yellow. So on the left is purple, the dark part is purple, the center is white, and then the far right is yellow, and then there are stars down the center. That is the suffrage flag. Mrs. Wester is asking, why were there so many more men than women at the parade that advocated women's suffrage? Why were there not more women? Were some women opposed to suffrage? Yes. There were many women who were opposed to suffrage. If you remember, I was talking about the anti-suffrage associations. There are a lot of women who don't believe that women should have the right to vote. And part of those reasons is, again, if they have the right to vote, then they have to serve on juries, or then they're going to be out becoming more politically involved, and they're not going to have as much time for their families, and they think that women are kind of anti-family or those kinds of things. So there is a very large chunk of women who did not believe that women should have women's suffrage. Why were there so many more men than women at the parade? I think because it's a spectacle. People were coming to see this spectacle. They weren't coming to support it. They were kind of coming to mock it. And there were many more men. I mean, there are 8,000 women who are marching in the parade. So the majority of those who are attending the parade, these are men who again, there are supporters who are in the crowd, but the majority of these are men who are kind of coming to mock and to ridicule and to harass these women. Sophie is asking, how long did the women picketing outside the White House serve in prison? It was a very short amount of time. It was just a matter of a day or two, but their treatment was so bad. They were treated so horribly in the prison. Again, a lawyer was able to contact a judge on human rights issues because they were being so abused. And they were released from prison. So it was not a very long time, but it was enough for many of these women to suffer the effects, kind of mental effects, some kind of traumatic stress involved with this, kind of through the rest of their life. Was white the color of suffrage uniforms because their goal was pure? Yeah, white is kind of the color of purity. Women are kind of seen as this moral authority. So white has kind of become this power color of women's suffrage. I think we've got time for one more question. Does anybody have another question? Okay.